Hello, and welcome to another episode of the ITPro Podcast. I'm Adam Shepherd.
And I'm Jane McCallion. And if you're wondering why we seem a little more high definition than usual, it's because we're using a lovely new set of Razer Siren X microphones this week, which have been kindly donated by Razer to help us record the podcast during lockdown.
That's right, because if there's one thing that we've learned over the course of this lockdown, it's that it's important to have the right equipment. Case in point, I've recently bitten the bullet and upgraded my desk chair from the cheap IKEA folding thing that I was using to a proper big swivelly leather monster of a thing, and honestly, it is a revelation. My back has never been this pleased with me.
Well, it reminds me of a similar graduation when I first started off as a journalist. I was a freelancer, and I went from kind of having the most rickety office chair that £10 will buy to having kind of a nice sort of fake leather one, and I'm quite pleased with the one that I've got at the moment, which was saved from a skip because I'm that kind of person.
Ooh, nice.
It's a nice office chair, good lumbar support. My podcasting setup can't quite be the same. My mobile podcast studio is currently my duvet on top of my head between two dining table chairs, but it could be worse. At least all podcasters are in similar slightly mad situations.
Yeah, quite. It's been very entertaining watching how the people who usually have like a lovely professional studio to record from are adapting to the lockdown.
Well, moving on from unusual podcast setups and excellent chairs, let's turn to our first story of the week. The World Health Organization, which, unless you have been living under a rock, you will have heard rather a lot about over the past few weeks, has had to double its security in the face of a huge spike in phishing attacks.
The organisation has gone from having one major security alert per month up to 8, which is a fairly huge spike.
Yes, and it seems that hackers are targeting top officials in particular rather than kind of lower level people and trying to work their way up like that. National cybersecurity organisations in the EU, UK, Switzerland and Israel have all warned that this could be a nation-state attack or several nation-states levelling attacks.
As you mentioned, it's top officials within the WHO's structure rather than the infrastructure of the organisation itself, which is being attacked, which is somewhat unusual for nation-state attacks of this kind of scale, if nation-state attacks they be, which often tend to focus on the technical infrastructure, gaining access to backups and databases and backends and things. And if you are trying to get into an organization through phishing, it's usually much easier to get in through the lower level employees who are less well protected than the higher ups, and then use things like privilege escalation to reach your intended target. This is a very strange attack pattern as they go.
Yeah, I mean, it raises questions about motive, really. Is it, when you see these kinds of things, when they go against profit-making organisations, businesses in other words, there are normally kind of two real motivations behind it. One is money, and the other is corporate espionage, and that's kind of it. For something like the WHO, money seems unlikely. Corporate espionage isn't really a thing. So what are we looking at here? Are we looking at a nation or some other kind of group that is looking to destabilize the WHO for some reason?
Well, that would be the usual takeaway from something like this.
Yeah.
If it were another organization, if it was, say, I don't know, the UN, for example, or the IMF, you could potentially speculate that there is some kind of political motivation behind it. But given that the WHO are on the front lines of coordinating the global response to one of the most devastating pandemics in history, that seems unlikely unless the attackers are somehow on the side of coronavirus, which seems bizarre.
Well, I mean, there's always the other, kind of the thing that has been orbiting around coronavirus the whole time, which is conspiracies that the whole thing is a fraud, conspiracies that it was made in a lab, all those kinds of things. And if that is your mentality and motivation, then perhaps you would go straight in at the top and just try and attack at that level, thinking that maybe if you started lower down you'd be fobbed off and they'd find you, and that kind of thing. That's kind of my suspicion as to what's actually going on here.
But then if that is the case, then why are they being flagged by national security organisations as nation-state attacks? I very much doubt that anyone with that kind of firepower and that kind of support is crazy and dedicated enough to launch a campaign against the WHO on a tinfoil hat hunch.
You never know. I mean, the two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, and we have previously seen some regimes encouraging groups who are following more fringe theories for whatever reason, and sometimes with no obvious reason. And if you're a paranoid despot type and you think that possibly it is all a scam to XYZ, then why not fund your cyber army to go looking for that evidence?
Motivations aside, the important thing is that the WHO is defending itself and is making every effort to ensure that its vital work in battling COVID-19 is not impeded by these attacks, and we wish them all the best in doing so.
Yes.
Next, the House of Commons is going digital, with MPs this week approving plans to resume sessions virtually via Zoom.
I think you mean resume. Oh yes. We've been locked up too long. My puns are getting worst.
Indeed, Parliament is resuming, if you will, with sessions due to be held from 2:30 p.m. on Mondays and 11:30 a.m. on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. Now, up to 120 MPs will be able to attend virtually via the popular video conferencing service Zoom, along with 50 MPs in the chamber, so long as they observe proper social distancing rules, effectively creating a hybrid model, if you like.
Yes, as it's being called. I definitely know which side of the camera I would like to be on. I would definitely not be betting on the camera. I know, we get worse. So this comes despite questions over Zoom's security, with many organisations, including apparently the MOD, banning its use. And indeed, today it came out that NHS staff are being urged to avoid using the tool as well. They're being told to use various others like BlueJeans. But Zoom has been fighting back against this perceived insecurity with a 90-day programme to up its security kind of profile.
Led by Alex Stamos, as mentioned in last week's episode.
And the newly released Zoom 5 brings 256-bit encryption to help allay some of the fears as well. However, the House of Lords is using Teams to conduct its virtual sessions rather than Zoom. And I understand that Teams is what's most commonly used in the civil service in general. So it's kind of interesting that the Commons has gone for Zoom.
Well, I mean, it's got the shadow cabinet already. You might as well have shadow IT to boot.
Oh, no. If you're still listening, we would like to remind our listeners, as well as any MPs, that they should be rather careful, though.
This is my favourite story from this week.
Indeed. Well, over to you then.
Wales's Health Minister, Vaughan Gething, was participating in a session of the Welsh Assembly, which is also using Zoom to conduct its meetings. And he addressed the Assembly shortly before launching into a foul-mouthed tirade against fellow Welsh Labour Assembly member Jenny Rathbone, forgetting to mute his mic, cueing consternation from the Assembly amidst no small amount of very obvious laughter from fellow members.
The hottest of hot mic situations.
Quite.
Ellen Jones, the Assembly's Llywydd, which is their equivalent to Speaker, tried to rein things in, saying, I think Vaughan Gething needs to turn his microphone off. Vaughan Gething needs to turn his microphone off. But yes, I don't think there was very firmly trying to shut that stable door after the horse is gone. That horse it's broken all levels of quarantine. He is gone.
So yes, mic discipline is more important than ever in our new age of video conferencing, and I'm sure the honourable member will have lived out many video conferencing pros' worst nightmares.
And now, in something that is related to neither COVID nor video conferencing, Microsoft is planning to release a new Surface Book 3 and Surface Go 2 in May, it is rumoured.
So this is the first non-COVID story that we've had in what feels like weeks, and it's a good one to boot. According to rumours, the new Surface Book 3 will use one of Intel's latest 10th generation processors, along with up to 32 gigabits of RAM and an NVIDIA Quadro GPU on higher-end models. This is further evidence that Microsoft is targeting creatives, graphic artists, video effects professionals, etc., with the Surface Book 3, which has always been one of the kind of key demographics that Microsoft has aimed that particular powerhouse device at.
Are they trying hard to eat Apple's lunch, do you think?
They are indeed, yes. This is very much a machine aimed squarely at creative professionals. It's always been the most graphically powerful of the first-party Surface devices, with the exception of the Surface Studio. And its features like the Surface Pen and the touchscreen and all of that kind of stuff that very clearly mark it out as being aimed at video professionals, effects professionals, etc.
Okay. The Go 2, though, is a bit different. It will have a larger display, faster processor, Core M3 and a Pentium Gold options.
Yeah, this is a follow-up to Microsoft's excellent Surface Go, which was intended to be a Chromebook competitor, but in actuality ended up being pretty much the best answer to the iPad in terms of a super portable productivity device that we've ever seen. It was also the first Surface device to come with USB-C, and setting at about £380, the Surface Go is one of the most affordable Surface devices out there, and it's excellent to boot, so I'm very excited to see a follow-up.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, you like them, but it does. I mean, it's nice to have a product launch happening. It's I am never normally this enthusiastic about hardware unless that hardware is a server, as you well know, and probably some of our listeners as well. But yeah, it's nice. But is it a bit of an odd time? Given that we can't. I know, it's portable devices, but we can't really go outside.
Yeah, it does feel a little weird, particularly, the Surface Go, which is super portable, but nobody can go anywhere. But having said that, it is a lovely little slice of normality to have amidst all the madness. And hopefully, when the new devices actually reach the UK, we'll be out of quarantine. It's time for a break now, but afterwards we'll be speaking to Professor Mark K. Smith, AI expert and CEO of ContactEngine, about the ins and outs of ethical AI.
See you shortly. Welcome back. AI is all around us, baked into everything from our smartphones to the security software that keeps us safe. But how do we ensure that these AI systems are being built in a way that is secure, sustainable and responsible? Here to discuss these questions is ContactEngine CEO, Professor Mark K. Smith. Mark, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
So, Mark, before we dive into the ramifications around ethical AI, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your background in the field.
Yeah, certainly. I'm a scientist by profession, but a long time ago. So I have a first degree in natural sciences and a PhD in biotechnology. But all of my career from that point to this has been based in the communication industry. So be that in the early days of online conferencing in the 1990s, when I IPO'd a business, through to today where I'm involved with a company that does outbound conversational AI.
So, Mark, can you tell us, how is ethical AI different from any other form of AI?
I think if you take back to where I originated in the world of science, I think computers and results of experiments aren't themselves ethical in construct. You need to apply a human layer to decide what ethical is. So I think the notion of AI being ethical is wrong. I think computers do not have that consciousness, but people do. But nevertheless, as AI advances to do things and make decisions which are difficult to explain, then it's important that ethics are applied to that.
So would you say that ethical AI is best applied to the development of AI rather than the technology itself?
I think you just need to. Most of the problems with ethical AI come from biased data sets. So if you were to take 1,000 photographs of airline pilots, or you were to take 1,000 photographs of primary school teachers, AI would arrive at a conclusion as to what the likely gender of a person is. Is that bias? Is that ethical, or is that just true? Now, the truth is, it's just true. And what AI is doing is shining a spotlight, if you like, on society's own bias. So the question you have to ask yourself is data biased? Yes, in almost all cases it is. So therefore, do you have to manipulate that data to satisfy ethics? The answer is probably yes. And if you do that, the biggest question of all is whose ethics do you choose?
Yeah. So the reality then is that, you know, when we start talking about the ethics of it, it's once you start asking the AI to make decisions based on what you have fed it, if the data set is already biased, or if society, if you like, is biased and you want to discontinue that.
Yeah, it's a human construct. It's a decision we make. And there are certain instances where that bias simply needs to be adjusted. And there are other instances where you think actually society needs to be adjusted. And I think that between those two things lies the truth.
Yeah.
So what do you make of efforts to impose regulation on the AI industry, such as those proposed by the European Union last month?
I think it's vital. I think all governments and larger umbrella organisations should apply ethical considerations to what's happening in the world. I think they're too slow. I think they're always too slow. And the pace of change in technology is so fast that governments can barely catch up. I mean, you were talking earlier on about UK government beginning to use online conferencing as a part of the way that our country is governed. I mean, for goodness sake, I used NetMeeting in 1994. I mean, this technology is some time ago and not at all startling in what it does and can be made secure, as Zoom will eventually prove. So government acts slowly and technology accelerates, and that is a problem. I think I don't have a strong view as to what the EU are doing. I think there are certain aspects of privacy controls which they've done well, and I think applying a hammer to some of the American behemoths to stop them behaving in ways that are evil is a good thing. I think, however, when you start to restrict access to data sets to only inside the European Union, that's stupid and that's counter-scientific. So there are good things in there and there are bad things in there. And I'm always terribly concerned about legislatures that don't have scientists in them. And my goodness, we are light on those, which explains a lot of the things that are happening with COVID at the moment, in my view.
Well, quite. You know, keep coming back to the eternal maxim of information wants to be free, and you know some of the issues around locking down the use of data sets does seem to run a little bit counter to that.
Yeah, it's just daft.
I mean, a counterpoint to what you're saying, though, Mark, would be the argument that data and technology are inherently neutral. So to take a slightly more, I guess, libertarian look at things, if data and technology are inherently neutral, they, in theory, could just go the right way, and we don't really need to legislate that much if we just kind of trust in the technology and trust in the data, then it will work out anyway.
Yeah, I mean, in a truly libertarian world where all the actors are good, I would agree with that as a philosophy. I think clearly, you were referring earlier on to increased phishing attacks across the globe, and that is beyond depressing. You have extremely talented, able and intelligent bad actors doing things that are wholly disruptive and certainly counter-libertarian and counter-humanity. So I think this is where government have a very significant role. In the same way that you can't have rampant capitalism, you can't have people left to die, and you can't have people with infinite wealth. Somewhere between those two things is where we need to be, hence progressive taxation systems which should apply equally to individuals and corporations, and of course don't. But you also have, in our country, healthcare free at the point of access and education free at the point of access, and that's the role that government should play. So in its very purest sense, AI is just a technology, and you could allow it free rein. But if you allowed, there's an interesting sort of philosophical debate. If you presented an algorithm with all the information around climate change, one of its conclusions may be to exterminate the human race. We probably wouldn't like that.
Not like that, yeah.
So speaking of which, if it comes down to effectively how we use these technologies, on the kind of macro level, how do you think AI can be productively used?
I think it's difficult for me to speak with authority in anything other than the work that I do. So that will mean I'm stepping into a sort of subset of AI, particularly around natural language understanding and machine learning. But if I was to focus on that, I think there are certain activities in life, in careers, which are a pointless use of a brain. I think there are lots of times where where humans are being asked to behave like machines, whereas what you should have is machines that are behaving more like humans. Now, that's easy to say, and the work that I do in the sort of complexity of AI is at the simpler end, still complex but simple. So what I do for a business is I engage in automated conversations with millions of customers of my clients all over the world, and I invite them to respond to a question I asked. If it's a spoken question or a written question, doesn't really matter what channel it happens through. And then if I get that response back, then you can build machine learning algorithms that you can train quite quickly to allow that conversation to continue to its conclusion. Now, I don't do much after dinner speaking, and what I'm about to tell you as a case study is the reason why. So if I'm trying to improve the likelihood of a washing machine technician turning up to your home with the right drum, I don't think it is a human being that should engage in that conversation with the customer. I think a machine should do it until it's resolved the registration number, the serial number of the device, and the type of noise somebody's hearing. And we do that for Whirlpool in the UK. Now, the alternative to doing that is twofold. Don't do it at all, silly. There are 100 drums in the range, something like that, and the little vans carry 2. Or get human beings to do it. Waste of time, and again, their brains are better off doing more complicated things. So in my world, the AI is doing stuff that humans are poorly equipped to do at the very complex end, or shouldn't do because their lives are worth more than that.
So when companies are developing AI systems, what would you say are the top ethical considerations they should bear in mind?
I think you need to consider it all the way through. We developed, it's a rather pleasing acronym when you spell it out, but we developed our own ethical philosophy as a business, which we had to because there weren't frameworks that really obviously work for us, and it goes as follows. Beneficial, what you're doing has got to be an advantage to the person you're communicating with. Ethical, that's a big one, but obviously you have to do things right, and I can come back to that if you like. Explainable, really, really, really important, this one. It is no good having black box AI and you get it to say something and it can't explain itself. That is wrong, and that is the case with most AI as a service products, actually, that they are black box, not white box. It then needs to be relevant, you've got to be doing it for a good reason, and fundamentally it needs to be secure. Beautifully, that spells out the word beers.
One of which I'd imagine you awarded yourself after you came up with that nickname.
God, yes.
But going back to the point you made about explainability, I think that is something that most AI professionals would agree on. But what role do open standards and kind of open technologies play in ensuring that kind of transparency, if you like?
It's just really hard, right? So if you're trying to drive a car using a machine, the decisions it makes are incredibly complex, and explaining why it did something is incredibly hard. Okay, I accept that. There is relatively little science about how you make this explainable, to the extent that I've only this week actually I've sponsored a PhD at King's College. A fascinating young man who's a brilliant Mongolian mathematician. That's a phrase I didn't expect to say a few weeks ago. Who is also a very fine artist. And what we're sponsoring over the next 3 years is explainable AI, that are visualizing AI. Now, I do not underestimate how hard that is at the very complex end of this, but I do think at the simpler end it's perfectly reasonable to do so. If, for example, your AI made a decision about your credit worthiness, and because you were a woman, not a man, it gave a different result, and you know what I'm talking about because this happened a few weeks ago, then it should damn well explain what it did. And that is entirely reasonable to do so. And at my end of the spectrum, the decision I made to include a certain drum in the van of a Whirlpool technician, I can explain exactly how that came about because I've got a full record of all the conversations that occurred with the customer. So it's a big issue, a really, really big issue, but it needs to happen in the same way that your credit rating can be explained. You know, you can go and look, I don't do this, but you can go and look at your Experian credit rating and it can tell you why you have the number you have. And that's a sort of form of explainable AI, I suppose, and that needs to apply to AI across the piece. As I say, black box unexplainable is wrong.
I've got to say that you speaking about visual AI has just made me think of, are you familiar with the Twitter account Normal Cat Pictures?
Sorry, I'm not, but I think I know where this is going.
Yes, it's let's just say that AI is not as good at making cat pictures as it is at this human does not exist, or this person does not exist. If you've seen that works perfectly. Cats do not work very well.
Fascinating project, and it is really quite terrifying how sophisticated that particular algorithm is.
Yeah.
I agree, and I can imagine what it's like. Personally, I think I'd spend more time on detecting cancer than cats, but that's just me.
Well, quite.
Anyway.
That was a very serious note, wasn't it? Apologies.
No, that's fine.
It is a very good point, though. There is a lot of practical applications, particularly in biomedical sciences and whatnot, where AI can have a really strong impact in terms of rapidly crunching through really high volumes of data. And the one that is constantly brought up is the stuff around X-rays and scans and whatnot, and tumor detection and that kind of thing, freeing up a huge amount of actual clinicians' time to do, as you put it, more human-centric tasks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the wetware that we carry in our heads is prone to break down. It forgets things, and it can't hold information in the way that computers can, and computers don't typically forget things. And if you've got a piece of AI that can hold 1 million images in its head with 1 million diagnoses in its head, then the chances are it's going to get the next one right. If you catch a consultant just after they've left the 19-hole on the golf course making a judgment, maybe they're not as good.
So, Mark, I mean, what we've spoken about just now is largely regarding what's known as, I believe, a specific AI. We're quite a way away from general AI. Should we even get there at all? Should it be possible? Is it worth, kind of trying to get AI to do, several things at once? Perhaps not true general AI, but a bit more, I don't know, multifaceted? Or are we better off just kind of sticking with perfecting specific AI use cases?
That's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, I think that the journey of discovery in science should be never ending, right? I mean, I think my approach with my own R&D team is go that direction. If this was a video, you'd see my arms pointing at about sort of 45 degrees because you don't know the outcome, but the direction should be forwards in some sense. So I think the notion of AI acquiring general intelligence, I mean, I personally think it's utter nonsense. But I'm a natural scientist, and people like me don't know what intelligence is. So making something artificial is pretentious, to say the least. Actually, I always take the same example. That after the machine beat us at chess, how did it feel? It felt nothing, and it couldn't make a cup of tea. It couldn't even get up and jump in the air and punch the. I mean, it's just general AI. It'll never happen, in my opinion. I think we are millions, and some would argue billions of years into an evolutionary process, and what's inside our heads is absolutely miraculous, and we don't understand it. There's lots of biological systems that we simply don't understand. No one actually quite knows how water gets to the top of trees, right? That's how little we know. So general intelligence in AI, yeah, have it as a holy grail, but the thing is, the holy grail is you never find it.
And if you do, you might melt your face off.
What? I'd pull you up here, Adam. The problem with melting you, well, A, you melt your face, that's Raiders of the Lost Ark.
I know, but
and B, the whole point of the guy dying or the woman dying from drinking the cup that she thought was the grail was she didn't find it, did she?
Yes, I know, but that's not a funny joke.
Yeah, well, you're not a funny person.
Well, on that note, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you once again, Mark, for joining us.
Absolute pleasure, enjoyed it.
And thanks once again to Razer for donating the Siren X microphones we used to record this week's show.
To find out more about everything we've talked about this week, head to itpro.co.uk. You can also read about ethical AI in next month's issue of ITPro 2020, or for a weekly digest of the most important business news from ITPro, The Week and Money Week, sign up for the Business Briefing newsletter.
You can also follow us on Twitter at ITPro, as well as Facebook and LinkedIn, or get in touch by emailing podcast@itpro.co.uk.
Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you find podcasts to never miss an episode. We'll be back next week with more news and analysis from the world of IT. Until then, goodbye.
Bye.
The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.